So often, it can feel when you're sitting in the audience at a big conference like this that the people who sit on this stage represent a set of decision makers to whom you may have very little access. That up here, there are conversations happening about the concepts and the theories, but also about how programs, policies, and products are designed, built, and delivered. But the people who deliver them and the low-income people we're trying to help have few avenues to affect those decisions. I believe you've seen this week our deep commitment at Prosperity Now to closing the racial wealth divide. But I want to tell you a little bit about other valuable work that we are doing as an organization to build a race equity culture. We aren't there yet, and I do invite all of you to help us get better at it. And I don't have time to give you the full journey, but I wanted to share something that I have learned deeply recently about what that means to build equity and to build equity into our culture. And that it's about changing who has access and influence with decision makers. It's about changing the way that we seek input. And most importantly, it's about building avenues for co-creating solutions together. Our theme this morning is setting the table. And I'm reminded of the great Shirley Chisholm and her oft-quoted statement, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I think sometimes that women, and as a white woman, I want to speak a little bit to my colleagues, that we have been so used to not having seats for decades that we're really grateful when we get them. And some of us have forgotten to look around and see who else didn't get a seat. So when we do get those seats, I want to encourage us all to keep bringing our folding chairs. But now they're for us to sit in while we give our seat to someone else. That's our job right now. To do this, to erase that unjust inequality we've been talking about, it's going to require us to do business differently. With all those chairs that we're bringing around the table, we're now going to make time and room for authentic engagement with each other, to learn more about the lived experiences of those affected by inequity and inequality, to work together to create solutions and solutions-making processes where we all have a seat at the table and the value we bring is evident. As we set the table for today's plenary, I want you to see across 3 different conversations how some people and organizations are starting this work. They have organized different tables for us to gather around, where the invitations have been to sit together as equals, where they've created space for dialogue and for disagreement so that we can find and forge new common ground, where the voice of the people who have been most systematically excluded becomes included, but no longer to say, what do you need? I'll deliver that for you. And to instead say, what's the solution? How can I help you build it? We'll open our conversation today with my friends, both of whom have been doing something very interesting over the last 2 years, and it is an incredible story of unlikely partnerships. In Nisha's case, in her work at the Urban Institute, running the Gates Foundation's Partnership for Economic Mobility, she brought together thinkers and doers in the academic and nonprofit communities from both the right and the left to tackle what can be done to address the fundamental problem of economic mobility in our country. Russell had a similar challenge at Convergence. How can a diverse group of stakeholders tackle the role of work in economic mobility? And his table was also ideologically diverse, bringing together corporate America, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and even right-leaning think tanks, I will have you know. After Nisha and Russell tell us a little bit more about how those dialogues came together and the results of that work, we're going to have a very interesting spotlight from Josh Friday. Now, I'll tell you that Josh was asked to stand on this stage last night. Our original speaker for this plenary fell ill, and so Josh, we offer our gratitude, I should say. And Josh is many things. He is the mayor of Novato, California, another mayor joining us. He is the incoming board chair of Demos, and he is the president of Cal EITC for Me, a statewide EITC campaign. And Josh knows that what's needed is to bring together the public and the private sectors to change the story of financial security in this country. And finally, we have a fascinating panel that looks at what else is happening in corporate America to organize these new tables for us to gather around. We'll hear how some companies are viewing their role as corporate citizens in a new light, including how they think about nonprofit partnerships in important ways. Camille Doucette from Brookings will talk with Rajneesh Gupta from Intuit, Waylon Lee from PayPal, and two powerhouses in the nonprofit world that we are honored to have as Prosperity Now board members. Gary Cunningham from Metropolitan Economic Development Association in Minneapolis, and our board chair, Ashish Advani of Junior Achievement Worldwide. I really hope you'll enjoy these discussions this morning, and I hope that they are useful to you as we think about our own roles in setting these tables and bringing the chairs for us all to come together to create solutions. So I'm going to turn now. I've teed you up. And I really am excited for you to hear these fascinating stories. So Nisha, I'm going to start with you. What was the Partnership on Economic Mobility, and who was there?
Yeah, so good morning, everyone, and thank you to Prosperity Now for having me here. Thrilled to be with all of you. So the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, I seem to be queen of like having the longest titles in the world, but every word in that title is intentional, right? So it was truly a partnership among the Gates Foundation, which supported the work, the Urban Institute, where it was housed, David Elwood at the Harvard Kennedy School, who chaired the partnership, myself as executive director, and all 24 members of the partnership. And I often talk about this group as the Justice League of poverty fighters. So, I mean, just an incredible, incredible group of people. Bill Bynum, who I know you heard from earlier in the conference, John Powell, Kathy Eden, Raj Chetty. So a mix of people, scholars, people actually running programs on the ground, a few wild card kind of thinkers, Arthur Brooks, so very different perspectives, sectors, points of view, which is often how I think you get the best thinking. And one of the things I think that was maybe kind of unusual or not usual enough is the majority of our group are people of color. And so that's not all you need to get to racial equity, but to Kate's point, like thinking about who is at the table when you set it is so important. And I know we're going to get into this in the conversation, but we had very diverse points of view, and we certainly had, with our focus, we had sort of one homework assignment in 2 years to answer one question. What would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? And lots of creative freedom in how to answer that question. And we had people who, at some point in their life may have lived in poverty. This is the issue that we were tackling. We didn't have anybody around the table in the beginning who was living in poverty at the time. And so that was something that we wrestled with, and how to bring that perspective to the table. And happy to share more about that in the conversation.
Sure. Let's first hear a little bit more about the group that Russell organized.
Terrific. Great to be with you all. I understand you were on the Hill yesterday, so I'm assuming you straightened all that out, and we can assume that there'll be no more challenges or gridlock. So thank you for that. So the table that we built at Convergence is consistent with our organizational methodology, which is we convene people from different perspectives who often don't agree, some of whom are even hostile to each other, in a dialogue process that typically lasts about 18 months. Kate sat at this particular table representing Prosperity Now and the great work many of you in this network do, which was fantastic. And so this particular project focused around mobility, and many of the same questions Nisha's work tackled centered on work for us. And so the question was, how through work can we use it as an engine of opportunity and a way to reduce poverty, especially for lower income Americans? And so the table that we built really went through a journey from initial trust building and some initial meetings that were tough. There are honest disagreements with folks at the table who have very different incentive structures, and ended up at a place where we built together a solution set that's going to be public soon, next week. So I'm going to tease it a little bit in today's session, but then it'll be live on our site at convergencepolicy.org starting next week. But the table that we built included some folks we thought were really important that sometimes aren't in these tables, and that was employers. We had representatives from big employers like Walmart, McDonald's, IBM, Hilton, that represented various industries and have a range of career pathways to offer, alongside folks you might think of as traditional folks in the anti-poverty space, right and left-leaning policy thinkers, and really on-the-ground doers. We wanted to make sure we had about half the table from outside Washington, so folks that are really on the ground working with low-income people, doing innovative job training, connecting folks from community college programs to work, whatever that might look like, sitting alongside somebody from Brookings and somebody from Walmart, and these folks that just don't get a chance to talk to each other. So it was a fascinating and hard and awesome 2 years, and we're excited to have built something together that we'll be able to share next week, and happy to dig more into the piece around including low-income voices, which was also really important.
Thank you. So what I loved both about being part of the Convergence dialogue and also about what Nisha did is that they allowed themselves time, right? And even now, I'm sure you think 2 years was not enough for both of you. And that allowed time for trust to be built in the dialogue, but it also allowed time for you to take stock and actually go out and have conversations with low-income people experiencing problems with economic mobility. Russell, tell us how you did that.
Definitely. Well, from the top, our stakeholders told us that we couldn't think about ladders upward when the floor underneath so many Americans is so unstable, right? And so the very issues you're tackling at this summit were front and center for us from the beginning. Kate and other smart people helping us think about that. And so we know, around 40% of Americans face enormous month-to-month financial instability. So we really went out through these stakeholders and had some conversations where we really had people tell their stories, but then asked them what would solve the challenges that they face, and tried to do it in a way that didn't use, a lot of jargon, but really talked about what's your life like. And what we heard was people, especially that live in high-cost cities, but I think this is true for folks in other places too, is that life is about survival, right? Life is about, I spend a lot of time commuting because I can't live close to my job because housing is too expensive, therefore I don't see my kids very much, and I work really hard at a low-wage job that sort of barely gets me through the month, or doesn't. And so that informed, for example, to draw that back to the group's work, we shared out these personal stories in our stakeholder conversations. How do we think about tools that would be really practical and could be implemented perhaps at low cost in the short to medium term? How could we smooth income? How could we find small ways for folks to have sidecar savings or to help them build wealth even at low-wage jobs? And how do we think about hard questions around where people can live, where they can live because of cost, and where they can live because of discrimination? And how do we knock down barriers? Our group, I think the last point that I'll make here, we built a set of principles at the top. You can imagine organized labor and Walmart sitting at a table comes in with some skepticism, to put it mildly. And so what we did at first was, let's build a set of principles together that we will hold our work up against and see if we're staying true to those. And those will be our North Star. One of those was calling out the role of employers, how important they are for our opportunity, which we thought was critical. But another one was, this group's goal is to knock down barriers put up by place and race and gender and other forms of difference. And so at a few points, stakeholders were like, hang on, does this solution do that or not? Let's think really hard about that. And let's go back to the conversations we had in San Francisco, where we heard from people that are trying really hard to get job training to move up in their career, but faced a ton of barriers. Like, would this thing address that or not? And it was a really helpful question to ask, to really hold these solutions up to real people's lives. Because we know that there are smart solutions out there that'll help everybody, but we have folks that have been disproportionately impacted, and we know that opportunity is not equal in America, and that often zip code, which is a strong overlay for race, determines someone's access to opportunity. So we thought a lot about those questions.
Good. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, so similarly, I started to talk a little bit earlier about who was physically around the table as we started, but from the very beginning, we said, not just who was at the table, but how did we want to go about our learning, right, and sourcing ideas. So a lot of great ideas with people who had long histories of working on these issues, and our team was based at the Urban Institute. So we certainly looked at the best data and evidence. We had Raj Chetty at our table, so we looked at his analysis around zip code. But we also said, you know, that's not enough. And I think one thing that is often a blind spot too often in both philanthropy and policy strategy conversations is people who are impacted by the conversation are left out. And I know we're going to talk about different things that the private sector is doing later this morning, and it's interesting. There's no private sector company, right, would design a product or service without first testing it with the consumers that they're trying to reach. So it's completely insane that we go about designing policy and philanthropic strategies without doing that. Yeah, think about that for a second. And so what we decided to do was, with each of our meetings, you know, we're not going to meet at the, you know, as great as those institutions are, at the Urban Institute, at the Harvard Kennedy School, we're going to spend time in communities. And so every time we brought our group together, we started off with a learning day, a site visit in communities, actually, and we talked to some excellent practitioners, and that's great. But executive directors of the top nonprofits are in these conversations. Some of you are in the room. We really wanted to hear directly from community residents. And so we spent time in 30+ communities around the country in very different contexts, right? Because poverty and mobility don't look the same in every community. And so whether that was in Detroit, or in East San Jose, or in Indian country at Lummi Nation, or in Tulsa, in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood in New York. Very, very different contexts. But what was interesting is we started to hear some common themes. And as we then began to generate ideas, we held a series of design labs to really kick the tires on the ideas and had people from different sectors, but also people with lived experience in the conversation, right? Helping to inform and I think overall really strengthen our ideas. And then when we wrapped up our work and we released our ideas, I think some of you who are in this room were in the room with us in May as we released all of our recommendations at our capstone event. We made a very intentional decision to say, we're going to do this event in DC, but we're going to do it in a part of the city actually not too far from, we're sitting, for those of you who aren't from here, we're sitting in Prince George's County, Maryland, and not too far from here, it borders Southeast DC, and so we held our capstone event in Anacostia, which is the part of DC which is the lowest income part of our city. You know, proud DC resident, but we've got a lot of issues that we need to tackle. But a lot of people fly into DC and they spend time in Northwest DC in a hotel ballroom, or they go to the Hill. But they're missing, and that could happen in any community that any of us go to for a conference, right? We said we want to get people in a part of the city that I often think of as a place, I don't know, it's often viewed as a deficit, and people miss all the assets and the vibrancy and the voices that are there. And we felt like it was really important to hold true to the way we went about our work. And so it's great for me to be able to sit up on a stage. I love it. There's nothing I like more than talking to a really smart group of people. But putting center stage, you know, not just the philanthropists, the policymakers, the business leaders, but also people who have the lived experience and are on journeys, and maybe they've gotten to a point where they're out of poverty and are on a pathway and they've achieved mobility, but having that be front and center and be part of the conversation, because sometimes I think we forget why we're all here. It can become about paper and policy, but we're talking about people's lives, and that has to be, I think, kept front and center.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've talked about who and how. So now in our last few minutes here, tell us a little bit more about what you came up with, and in particular for this group, how financial security and financial insecurity showed up in your recommendations.
Sure, and I have a couple of quick graphics I'd love to put up, if we can put up that first slide. So you'll see these three circles, and you know, I would say financial security was part and parcel of our definition of mobility. So that was one of the first things we did. We said, okay, if we're going to dramatically increase mobility from poverty, what do we mean by mobility? And we, you know, from all of these community conversations and then all the people who were formally around our table, the 24 members of the partnership, we started to coalesce around this idea that, you know, yes, economic success, which is what so many people in this room work on, which really speaks to income and wealth and financial security, that's foundational, it's fundamental. So that's got to be there, and we recognize that from the beginning. But we also pretty quickly said it's not enough. And John Powell, one of our partnership members, in that very first gathering of our group, said something that resonated, I think, with everyone and in all of the communities that we spent time in. He said, here's the thing about poverty. It's not just about a lack of money. It's also about a lack of power. And so this is the second principle around, yes, we've got to keep pushing. We are not where we need to be in terms of closing the racial wealth gap and of helping more and more people move up income ladders. But we've got to also think about agency, which speaks to having a say over the trajectory and what happens in your life. And what if we started to measure that? And then third, this idea of being valued in community. And what was so interesting about this, Kate mentioned we had different political points of view around the table. And so John Powell, who comes, I would say, from a much more progressive point of view, talks about this concept as belonging, right? Belonging versus othering, which is often the perspective that we have in this country about people living in poverty. They are somehow other or different or outside of. And a lot of race, I think, underlies a lot of that. But Arthur Brooks, who comes from a much more conservative perspective, we realized really quickly, he was talking a lot about dignity and respect and having meaning. And these are part and parcel of this same concept, right? And so we felt like mobility is also that. And then I've got a quick second graphic. It won't surprise probably any of you. As we were developing our strategies, we put forward 13 different idea papers, which you can find at mobilitypartnership.org if you're interested. But really, we let all those ideas bubble up. And then we said, how do they all hang together? And what became very clear is not one of those ideas on its own was going to dramatically increase mobility from poverty. It's going to take 5 things, which we really quickly shorthand as narrative, jobs, place, people, and data. And the work around financial security became very clear to us that fits into this idea of place. Because, looking at all of the data, looking at the data that Raj Chetty and his colleagues have produced, you can see that right now, zip code can determine your destiny. And your access to financial services are often connected to place, right? And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. You all know this really, really well. So that's where we would place the work in this strategy.
Great. And so I think it's actually very interesting, having heard about kind of similar time spans and big, broad framing questions, to hear, Russell, how our group landed in not a place that's different necessarily from a values perspective, but looks quite different. Tell us where we landed.
Definitely. So our theory of the case was that a couple of things under this rubric of focusing on work, as I mentioned earlier. One is that the solutions had to come both from public policy and all of the other actors. We couldn't leave one of them out. That's why we had business at the table. That's why we had other sectors represented to develop partnerships. And number 2, we wanted to move things in the short to medium term. Our group was not doing a long-term visioning, what's the future of work. We talked about those issues, they're interesting, but we really wanted to think about what levers can we pull in the short term now. Folks are financially insecure now, and we have a tightening labor market. There's an opening now to address issues like the racial wealth gap. And so those were a couple of things that undergirded the work, and I think if there's a graphic there for our project, I'll just highlight basically the buckets that we landed on, which again all touch on work. So one is increasing basic financial stability, which we talked about earlier, things like income smoothing, reforming asset limits in ways that just sometimes are sort of crazy how they're structured now. There was a whole deep set of work around workforce. This is where our employer partners were so helpful, and I think there was a lot of deep mutual understanding around the table as we went along. It was really cool to see people say, all right, I still don't agree with where you want to go here, but like I get your incentives when you wake up are different than mine. You have shareholders and I don't. And let's talk about what does that mean? You're not evil. We want to have good outcomes for Americans of all income levels, but we just have different incentives. And so that was really powerful in the workforce conversation. How do we really build ladders up? Some exciting ideas are going to be in the report, including regional employer partnerships and things like investing in higher ed, which you're seeing folks like Walmart and McDonald's roll out in real time, talking about driving to impact and our dialogue really impacting real practices inside these big companies. Increasing access to quality jobs, that's things like paid leave. We are going to call for a paid leave standard, which unbelievably, obviously, as this group knows, we don't have in this country, and things that don't seem as sexy but are really important, like predictable schedules. We know that a lot of folks, we've done a good job reducing the number, but many, many low-income folks still have unstable schedules that make it very hard to have a stable life and month and upward mobility. And then lastly, how do we knock down barriers? So that's things like how do we make sure folks have been incarcerated, have a pathway back to jobs, How do we make sure folks that have longer than a 3 or 6 month unemployment stretch, which can be just devastating on a traditional resume, we've got to move away from those. We've got to better signal the skills that I possess and the skills the employer needs so we can match those up. And reforming things like occupational licensing. So there's a lot here. These are the buckets that we landed on, which we think together, under the rubric of work, are actionable in the short term, have a strong role for both public policy and the private sector, and are things our group is now publicly going to commit to move forward by a set of concrete actions over the next several months.
Great. So there you have it. When you set new tables, this is what we can come out with. I hope that you all take some time to read both of the reports, and I think they offer useful frameworks for conversations also that can happen at a local level as well. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Russell, for joining with us today.
Thank you.